I'm Mary Ann Babinski, Dean of the Faculty of Law at UBC, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this wonderful UBC event that brings together students, alumni, and other members of the broader UBC community to hear two outstanding UBC graduates speak. We have with us today two people who need no introduction, and yet here I stand. So I will be as brief as possible so as not to infringe on the time of our speakers. We have Catherine Gretzinger, well-known voice of our national radio, specifically CBC's The Afternoon Show. She graduated from UBC with a master's in journalism in 2006 and is now sharing her experience with UBC journalism students as an adjunct faculty member. We don't often get to see radio personalities in person, and so this is a wonderful treat for us. We also have Kim Campbell, described as a woman of firsts. Among her well-known firsts, she was the first female president of the freshman class, first of female Justice Minister and Attorney General of Canada. She was Minister of National Defence of Canada and the first female Minister of Veteran Affairs, and of course, among many firsts, the first female Prime Minister of Canada. We are delighted that she has both a BA and a LLB from University of British Columbia, and an honorary degree awarded in 2000. She's received many awards and distinctions, including an award of distinction from the UBC Alumni Association. She's a companion to the Order of Canada and a recipient of the Queen Elizabeth II Golden Jubilee Medal. And I think my time for introductions has actually expired. And so let me just invite you to warmly welcome our distinguished guests to this wonderful event.
Wanted to play the Freddie Wood.
Well, why don't you sing to fill time until we're mic'd? Actually, Kim Campbell could sing for you this afternoon and sing very well, I might add.
Well, to cries of don't quit your day job.
Thank you for coming home and spending some time with all of us this afternoon.
It's great to be here, even in the rain. It shows you how homesick I am, folks.
You know, a lot of people succeed in the world and then they come home and they keep their heads down, they spend time with friends and family, they go to their favorite restaurants. When you come home, you always make it a point to come back to UBC, to speak to the public broadcaster, to do events. How come?
Well, because you nag me. Well, you know, it's interesting. I often say I didn't plan to make a career out of being a former prime minister, but it's a bit like having gum on your shoe, you know, it sort of sticks. But it's also, you know, I was saying to a group of people last night, so much of what I do now is a result of my life here, and I feel very connected to it. We'll talk a little bit later. I think you wanted to talk about democracy promotion. And thanks to the voters of Vancouver, I held elected office at all three levels of government in Canada, and I learned a great deal. It was as much a part of my education as what I did in the classroom here at UBC. And so I feel very connected and very, very grateful for what I learned here. And so it's sort of nice to come back and say to people, no, I'm still alive, and I hope making good use of the lessons that, that many people worked very hard to let me have. So I feel a sense of obligation, but also great friendship. I mean, this is, you know,
these are your peeps.
Friends. Yeah, it's my gang. You know, and it's also a great pleasure for me to see people grow and change, and you know, people who were doing very different things when I was in office now, you know, having successful businesses and families, whatever. So the continuity pleases me. It makes me happy.
So much was made in 1993 of your becoming the first female prime minister in Canada. It's 17 years later. You're still the only female prime minister. What are your thoughts on where we're at in terms of gender and democracy in this country?
Well, I must say it does discourage me that I don't see a woman on the horizon, you know, looking likely to be able to do that. And I think there still are a lot of challenges. You know, somebody has written a paper. They talk about the glass, what they call the glass precipice. That when parties are in a pickle, then the women are supposed to pull the rabbit out of the hat, and maybe that had something to do with how I got to be leader. It may have been part of it. I don't think it was entirely it, because in fact, when I first went to Ottawa, I would go and speak at, constituencies of my colleagues, and people would say to me, when Brian Mulroney steps down, you're going to be our next leader, which was actually kind of horrifying, because, if there's no vacancy, you don't want to be seen to be, an applicant for the job. But
Hasn't deterred the Liberals in the province, though, has it?
but it's, I think that, politics is hard for women. This is a big country, so at the national level it's difficult. I think at the provincial and local level, it's a little easier for women to do it. But I just see so many remarkable women. And I belong to this organization, the Council of Women World Leaders, which is women presidents and prime ministers, both current and former. And there are now about 38 of us. And, these women are quite remarkable. I look at some of the women who've recently retired, Chandrika Kumaratunga of Sri Lanka, Michelle Bachelet of Chile. And, these are, women can do it. They can and should do it. And parties need to make it possible to recruit the best women into their ranks and to build the strength in the cabinets and the ministries to give women experience. Although men don't worry about having experience. They're quite happy to do that. I have a friend who's quite an expert on gender issues, and she worked for a major investment bank in New York developing their global leadership and diversity program. It's a major bank. I won't mention the name, except that it's been much vilified lately. You can probably guess. But anyway, she went around the world interviewing their employees, and she discovered that the only people in this huge investment bank who thought it was a meritocracy were white men. Nobody else thought it was a meritocracy. But the other thing is, she says that men have positive illusions. So if you go out into the streets of, say, Canada or the United States, and you say to a man, you could be prime minister. He says, oh yeah, well, I don't really have time, but yes, I probably could. But if you say that to a woman, even if she's just leapt tall buildings in a single bound, she will tell you all the reasons why she can't do it. And and I don't. That's kind of a stereotype, but I think that women often do need a lot of persuading that they're good at things, that they can do things, and there are a lot of things that you start to do with a basic set of skills, but that you also learn while doing. There isn't really any school to be prime minister. And you observe and you watch others. But, Brian Mulroney became prime minister. He had never held a line ministry. He had never been elected to parliament until a year before he became prime minister, when he served as leader of the opposition. He was elected leader of the party. Elmer MacKay gave up his seat. He was elected in Nova Scotia, and they served as leader of the opposition. So he'd never run a line ministry. And if you said to a woman who'd done those same things, why don't you run? People say, oh no, I couldn't do that.
Need more experience.
Yeah. I guess Belinda Stronach went through that as well when she tried to do it. But it's just that there are all sorts of sort of self-indulgent men who, and you see this in the United States, sort of putting themselves forward to be president, men who've sort of never done anything. But where are the equally self-indulgent women with positive?
But do we want those self-indulgent people to be our leaders? Yeah.
Well, actually, it just occurred to me that maybe there is an exception in the United States, and I better quit while I'm ahead. Well, but I think here's what I would say. I do not believe that we should have more women in politics because women are better. I don't believe that. Some of the people I admire most in the world, some of the people who have supported me most strongly, some people who have been my inspiration, are men. But the point is that there are lots of wonderful women, and what women bring is the fact that they, in some ways, see the world differently. They live a different kind of life, and they have a different set of strengths to bring and a different set of weaknesses to be compensated for. And there's lots of research that shows that when you have diversity in decision-making, you get better decisions, that you don't get the same kind of groupthink or the kind of reinforcing of certain kinds of group dynamics that happen in homogeneous groups of people. So that's my concern, that I think there are a lot of gifted women who could make a wonderful contribution. And I think women have a lot to learn from men about how to use power and how to operate in these kinds of environments. I think men are often much better at it than we are, in the same way that men have a lot to learn from women in how to get the most out of the processes of policy building, how to reach out and consult and question your own assumptions without worrying that somehow you're losing face to do so. So I think it's, to me, diversity is really the answer, and gender diversity is one of the fundamental characteristics, but then you also need diversity in terms of ethnic background, generation, particularly today with the technology changes. I think generational diversity is extremely important, and just different kinds of perspectives on the world.
Given that democracy in Canada continues to be largely driven by white males of a certain age, what does that say about the state of our democracy in this country right now?
Well, I think we may sometimes be a bit over-optimistic in how quickly one can make cultural change. And, you know, by the time children start school, they have a very deeply embedded notion of what it means to be male and female in their society. And a lot of that comes not just from what they hear in their homes, but what they see. And if they don't see a lot of them, one of the things that was important for me, and what a lot of my supporters felt when I became Prime Minister, was that this created a new visual that young people looking could say, well, you know, here's a woman and she's doing this, and that's why I'm sorry I wasn't there longer, just if only to be, you know, for the demonstration effect of being there. You know, so I think it does take a lot longer. And there's so many, I was at a conference at Harvard recently, the Council of Women World Leaders, we sponsored it with the Kennedy School, looking at the business case for diversity. And there's a lot of research that shows that even when you have diverse bodies of people, there are ways in which decision-making still gets skewed. In other words, there's still a lot we have to learn about how we interact with each other and how our preconceptions and predispositions influence the way we perceive, the way we evaluate certain messages that we hear. But the one nice thing, and it's important to say this in a university, the one nice thing about the advances in social psychology, cognitive psychology, doing some very, very interesting work, is that we can kind of get to the bottom of these things. We can understand that it isn't just mean people trying to keep, you know, nice women out of office. It's that we are all the products of our society. There is an interesting test you can take online that was developed by some psychologists at Harvard called the Implicit Attitude Test. I think it's like IAT.com, but if you put in Implicit Attitude Test in Google, you'll find it. And many years ago, I took this test, and what happens is they flash images and you kind of respond to how you associate with it. Could be science or whatever. And I discovered that I associated men with science more than women. Well, you know, throw myself out of a basement window in despair. But what that means is, I certainly intellectually strongly support the rights of women to be scientists. But it means I come from a culture and a society where women just aren't as visible as scientists. And we're all products of that. So we're constantly struggling between our intellectual views and our kind of conscious views of how we think the world should be and the values, and the reflex and kind of visceral programming that is part of simply being in a human society. And so when we have these hypotheses that we lay down from the time that we're born, and maybe even before we're born, about who gets to do what, that influence our reactions. For example, when I was Prime Minister, it was very interesting, and particularly the Ottawa Press Gallery.
Don't look at me like that, I wasn't there.
No, you're not. But seriously, the reporters in the Ottawa Press Gallery, you may not know it, but they own the political process. And if they didn't make you, and they don't quite understand how you got there, they're very disturbed. There's a kind of a visceral discomfort. And I remember one of the reporters, who shall go unnamed, but he has the same last name as the royal family, said to me one time with a visible curl of the lip, "I've known every prime minister since Lester Pearson." And the implication was, and you don't look or sound like any of them. And my reaction was, well, Rudy toot toot for you. But the point was, I didn't look or sound like any of them. And for him, it was like, ooh, I didn't fit there. And so, but we all have that. It's not just this particularly obnoxious person, but when people have that kind of very deep sense of how they think the world should work, and you come along and you don't fit in with it, you can have a real problem. You will never get the benefit of the doubt. And people will look for reasons to validate their visceral discomfort at your presence. So you will say something, it was very interesting. When I did a paper, after political retirement had been thrust upon me, I spent about a year at the Kennedy School, first at the Institute of Politics, and then at the Joan Shorenstein Center for the Study of Press and Politics. And in the second fellowship, I was supposed to write a paper on some aspect of the press and politics. And I had just started negotiating a contract to write a memoir, and I thought, well, maybe I could do something about the press coverage of the '93 election. I'm going to have to write about it in my book anyway. And I had a big archive, that the Privy Council office puts out a brick every day of all the press clippings, depending on what it's about. So during the election, I had a brick of all the press clippings across the country that dealt with the election. I had transcripts of all of my press scrums. I had transcripts of all of my television and radio interviews. So I had the whole archive of my involvement with the press. And what was fascinating was, and I said, I can't be objective about this. So what I need to do is find some topic. So I thought I'll write about what the press thinks about the coverage. And there was a theme throughout the coverage, and the theme was how unfair the coverage was, without any effort to explain why. And so somebody would write, you know, Kim Campbell said such and such, and we jumped all over her, and Jean Chrétien said the same thing, and we left him alone. Gee, that Jean Chrétien sure can manipulate the media. But the point was that Jean Chrétien could put both feet up to his knees, and, you know, and any other appendage. I don't mean that he physically could do this, but, you know, metaphorically, he could do this. But you see, he belonged there.
Yeah.
And so if he made a funny comment or said something, because, well, that's just Jean Chrétien. If I even put a tiny little toenail between my lips, it was, you see, she doesn't belong there. And I actually see a lot of this in the coverage of the current president of the United States, this kind of underlying looking for a reason to develop. Now, it doesn't mean he doesn't make mistakes. And actually, part of the problem is, when you're looking at the coverage, that's why I didn't try to write about my own views of the coverage. I thought, what do journalists say about it? Because it is hard to parse out what are, in fact, the actual mistakes you make. I'm not perfect, I make lots of mistakes, from those which people attribute to you that you didn't make. And of course, the famous one was the opening statement of the election, when I supposedly said there'd be no new jobs till the year 2000, which I never said for a nanosecond. You know, when will unemployment reach, you know, acceptable levels? I said 2, 3, 4 years. Then, taking a breath, looking at something totally different, I said, because I'd been talking about getting the deficit under control, I look forward to the year 2000, because you may recall we were sort of beginning to think about millennium then, when, you know, unemployment will be way down, and we'll be paying down the deficit, and there'll be a whole new prospect for Canadians. But, I mean, Jean Chrétien's a very smart politician, and he grabs it, you know, Kim Campbell says no new jobs till the year 2000. But everybody jumped on the bandwagon. You know, and then there was a big debate about whether I was just being honest, and so I was getting, you know, debated about the validity of something I never actually said. But when you're the person that's in that situation, it's very frustrating because you can't quite figure it out. And at the time, I didn't really understand it. I then went on to teach a course called Gender and Power at the Kennedy School, which really gave me a chance to get into a lot of the very good academic literature that looks at these kinds of perceptual challenges. And I found it very, very helpful. I mean, it was too late for me, but it was interesting to do it. But
What did you find?
Well, just the research that shows, for example, there's a very good book by Virginia Valiant, who's a social psychologist, called Why So Slow, the Advancement of Women. And she talks about the gender schemas, the kind of frameworks and sets of hypotheses that we create from our very tiniest days about what it means to be male and female and how these influence us. But there's just tons of very excellent research out that shows to what extent leadership is gendered masculine and how hard it is to get beyond that. It's not impossible, but the fundamental thing for getting beyond it is for women to be there, because we need to change the landscape from which people derive their sense of how the world works. And if women are there, even if they have a hard time, I would very much like to have been prime minister longer. There are a lot of things I can, look at in that period of time that were very painful and difficult, but I don't for a nanosecond regret being there, because I get letters all the time from little kids. We're doing a project in social studies on the prime ministership, and I'm writing about you. And I think if I'm not there, there's no woman for them to write about. And, and I created a website, kimcampbell.com, if you remember. We're not selling anything, there's no advertising. But I created that because I think this is important, that, and not just for little girls, for little boys, to know that this is something, that there was a woman there.
My son is 9, and he said, when I said what I was doing today, I'm going to speak to a former prime minister, and her name is Kim Campbell, and he said, a girl? And I said, no, a woman. And then he said, that is so cool. He didn't even know that was possible.
But that's why I think it is important, and there are so many remarkable women in so many fields, and academia is not the easiest area for women. I'm in the middle of the university, so I'll restrain some of my more pungent comments that I can make, but it is a hard environment. A lot of women have really struggled against the kind of the skepticism, I think, which is the hardest part, to just be there and do well and be excellent. We just, having lunch with the dean, and Marianne's not even the first woman dean of the UBC Law School. Yay, I mean, there was a time when this would have been almost unthinkable. And what women went through to be accepted into the legal profession, and yet now all over, both as practicing lawyers and scholars and officials and policymakers, I mean, they're doing all sorts of wonderful things. So the fact that women put up with the guff to make it possible for subsequent generations of women to be much more accepted, and they did this by their excellence, is really, really important. But in public life, I would be much happier to see more women, because I think that, A, they do it very well, and it's very important, and they provide an important aspect of diversity to the decision-making process.
When did you become so passionate about democracy? The question of it, the pursuit of it?
Well, it's very interesting, because I was thinking, a few weeks ago, I was giving a commencement address at the University of Alberta, and I was thinking how we all live in the same present, but depending on how old we are, we see it very differently. And it was almost shocking for me to think that I was talking to a group of students for whom the Second World War was farther away than the First World War was for my generation. When my parents were both in uniform in the Second World War. In the First World War, you'd go to our Armistice Day and there'd be the old First World War veterans. But for this group of students, the Second World War is farther away than that. So we see it differently, and how we interpret things and what sense we make of it. It depends very much on what our past has been, even though we're all together in the same present. And because I was born right after the war, and both my parents were in uniform in the war, and if you'll remember in the early days of television, The World at War, narrated by Sir Laurence Olivier, all these wonderful programs and documentaries. The Second World War was an extraordinary experience, and I very much, became kind of, not obsessed is the wrong word, but just very fascinated by it. Fascinated by Hitler and what he did. And I remember when I was in high school, and I discovered that I could move people when I spoke, it actually scared me. Because I knew that was one of the things we learned about Hitler, that he was this very kind of charismatic speaker, and he kind of would get people, I'm always afraid of leaders who appeal primarily to my anger, because we all have buttons you can push. Out here in British Columbia, you can push our buttons about, we don't get no respect, we're the Rodney Dangerfields of Confederation, and, we all have buttons, because the world isn't perfect, and we all have things that causes that can make us excited. But once our buttons are pushed and we're foaming at the mouth, we're not really in the best position to, solve problems or move the world forward in a great way. So
we have to come back and talk about the Tea Party now that you've said that, shall we? Okay.
But anyway, I became very interested in how these things happen. But it's interesting, I didn't see myself as a politician, because I came from Vancouver. I was far away from the national capital, and my parents voted, but they weren't particularly active in politics. I wanted to be the first woman Secretary General of the UN. That's what I wanted to be. It was to make, I wasn't going to be Miss America, so I could say I wanted world peace, so I had to be Secretary General of the UN. So anyway, there were your choices, honey, if you wanted world peace. So anyway, but it did matter to me, because, and I remember I used to lie in bed and I'd read these books, and I'd sort of think all these people who got killed, and I think, each one of them was like a person like me, and they had kind of a consciousness, and it would overwhelm me. I just couldn't fathom it. So that was why I guess, so from a very young age, I wanted to do something to make the world not be like that, not have that kind of conflict again. And then as I got older, politics became something that seemed to be a reasonable vehicle for those kinds of instincts and desires. And
so school board, then you try to take a run at provincial politics, end up going and running
and
federally.
Aren't you sorry I didn't win the leadership of the Social Credit Party?
But there wouldn't have been a Fantasy Gardens. Whatever do you mean?
Through the heart.
When you
see, I'm not running for anything, you see, and I come back and I go, ooh, there's this sort of sense of deja vu in the air again.
Okay, we better talk about what's...
I've seen those teeth before.
Would you like to tell us what you think?
There's a certain generational tone to the laughter.
Don't impose your values on our audience, please. Gordon Campbell. Just a few months ago, he was riding the wave of popularity, running around with his red scarf during the Olympics, feeling great, so proud of the province. Now he was at 9% in the polls the week before he decided to pull the plug.
I was never at 9%.
Actually, Gallup had you as the most popular prime minister ever at one point during your campaign. Now, Gordon Campbell.
So it shows you that there are lies, damn lies, and statistics.
What do you think of what's gone on with him?
Well, first of all, as I mentioned on your esteemed radio station this morning, first, I don't live here, so I'm not going to give you great detailed comments about the politics here, but what struck me is that from press coverage I read that, I mean, Gordon Campbell, I think, has done a great job, and I think he's made a huge contribution to the province and to Vancouver as mayor before. But he got caught up in an issue of the harmonized tax, where he perceived not to have been candid with the electorate before an election about it. And, you know, I was part of the government that brought in the GST. And, you know, we didn't bring it in to be mean. We had a tax that was not working, the federal sales tax, that was prejudicing our exports and costing us jobs. And looking at how to replace it, a multi-stage value-added tax was by far the best result. But they are difficult, they're annoying to people because they're administratively complex. But that same complexity is also what tends to make them fair and difficult to evade. And so we took the leap and brought in the GST, knowing that it would be very unpopular. And if you may recall, in the '93 election, the Liberals were all saying they were going to get rid of it, and Sheila Cobb said, well, if we don't get rid of it, I'm going to resign. And they didn't get rid of it, and then she was forced to resign and run again just because she'd said that. But the point is that very often, you know, parties, you know, are really glad that the other side brought in the good but controversial policies, because it means they don't have to take the heat for it. And I think the harmonization is probably a good idea, probably, you know, in a business sense, and if you need to balance it with other things. But how you do things is really important. And to do something in a way that loses the trust of the electorate, I think is, you know, very dangerous.
He's a veteran politician. Yeah. That seems like politics 101. Don't tell people one thing and do something else. They get mad. So how can this happen?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm neither his wife nor his shrink, so I can't. But you know, even good people make mistakes, or even good people may say, well, the hell, though, we need to do this, or I don't want to get into another. I don't know. I mean, you have to get him on the stage and ask him. But I do think it's a pity, because I think what it does is it puts a complexion on a political career that really deserves a better evaluation. And I think he will get that. But I'm just sorry to see him step down under those circumstances. If he said, look, you know, enough is enough, I'm tired, time to, you know, bring in new people, that's one thing. But, you know, so it's too bad. But, you know, it's also part of the democratic process. You know, even on election night in 1993, when we had been pummeled, to put it mildly, there's still something inside that you say, you know, but it's a democratic process. And even if you think the voters are wrong, the voters are never wrong, because they make the decision. And particularly now that I do a lot of work in democracy promotion in other parts of the world, it's actually kind of miraculous that people defeat governments, and the governments leave the stage, and they come back and they fight another day, and sometimes they get reelected, you know, back and forth. It's all a matter of selling your message and trying to win support for it. And it's such a wonderful thing. And the only way it works is to have a loser. Every election there has to be losers. And the ability to lose an argument and to lose an election gracefully are one of the hallmarks of a democratic mindset. And, you know, we take it for granted. And I remember the night of the election in '93 when I, you know, wished Prime Minister-elect John Cardew and his wife well, and you know, some people in the audience went sort of, but you know, it is a wonderful thing. And the burdens were not going to be his. And he needed our support and loyal opposition. You know, fair to criticize, fair to critique, fair to hold the government accountable, fair to offer an alternative vision. But the person who's been legitimately elected has the right even to make mistakes. He has the right to be wrong. And I'm flying out tonight to Kiev, where on Thursday I'll be participating in a big public panel called What is Freedom of Speech? And in former Soviet countries, because the party governed by virtue of the pretense that it had the highest level of consciousness, of course, if you criticized it, you were challenging the fundamental legitimacy of those in office. So, of course, it was subversive and you had to be hammered down. But in a democracy, people are still legitimately in office, even if they make mistakes. The public will replace them if they decide in the next election, or they may forgive them and return them, or if they think there isn't an alternative. But it's a whole different philosophy, and we expect people to speak their minds, because it's part of the discourse that goes into figuring out what you should do and what you can do, because sometimes what you should do is maybe not politically sustainable at this stage, and you have to build a constituency for it, whatever. So it's a very, very different philosophy and approach to how we speak. And So at the end of the day, even losing is part of a winning scenario in the sense that it reflects the exercise of a democratic mandate. And it's a great and wonderful thing. And there are a lot of people in the world who would very much like to have, even our crazy politics.
Can we talk for a moment about what's going on in Haiti? It seems to me, as somebody who has spent as much time as you have thinking about how do you foster democracy in countries that have not had histories of strong democracies, looking at what's happened there with the election over the weekend, the international community has been full of bluster and rhetoric, but nobody's doing anything yet. What ought to happen in Haiti?
Well, I mean, I don't know the answer to that question. I think that that a government that is not legitimate, if people are not confident, will be a government that can't do anything. And it may mean that the international community will have to try and prevail upon the Haitians to have another election, to step back a little bit. I mean, I just don't know. But it is sad. I belong to an organization called the Club of Madrid, an organization of former presidents and prime ministers, and we had a conference, our annual meeting recently, where we had a very interesting discussion on Haiti, because we've been asked to be part of the rebuilding there, in terms of the institutional rebuilding. And there were several people there, and including one of the ministers from the Haitian government, who were arguing that, everybody's portraying Haiti as being just a total disaster, a year later it's still a mess, but they said it actually takes a long time for countries to rebuild after disasters. Even after the tsunamis, which didn't in fact destroy the government structure. I mean, in Haiti, a lot of their institutional structure was destroyed. The people were in their offices, and the offices fell down, and so much for the people who were the administrators and bureaucrats, whatever. And the argument was that in fact it wasn't such a disaster, that things were moving ahead. But of course then cholera comes, and they're all, it's really just a terrible, unfortunate set of terrible circumstances all at once. But I think that Haiti's never, the government and democracy has never been very strong there. So.
But isn't that where the international community should come into play? I mean, we've got an international crisis group, we have a United Nations, we have groups like the Club of Madrid and others who spend time bringing together incredible minds to think through the process of democracy and think about ways of fostering democracy. Is that not when the international community needs to mobilize and support?
Well, I think they are, and I think people are there, but you can't, people have such short attention spans now. You sort of think you must be able to do things right away. Here you have people who are still living in tents. Now, they've actually been doing a lot. One of the people was commenting that, journalists go there after a year and they still see rubble in the streets in the city. So they say, there's still rubble in the streets, it's a mess. So what they don't understand is that the rubble that was on the main streets has all been cleared away. But the big trucks, machines that go and pick up the rubble from the small street, they can't go into the small streets. So during the night, the people pick up the rubble from those streets and deposit them on the main streets where they can be picked up by the big trucks. So people come and they see there's still rubble on the main streets, but they don't realize that that rubble represents what has been collected during the night from the areas that big machines can't get into, and that gradually the rubble is in fact being cleared away. So you have to know what you're looking at. And you have to not sort of put your head on other people's shoulders or just assume because you were there a year ago, you go back a year later and you know what's going on. You have to know what you're seeing. And the things that I was hearing at that meeting were actually quite optimistic about the ability of Haitians to get it together. But if you look at the United States for a minute. The United States Congress has become dysfunctional. And the old sort of traditions of bipartisanship, of coalitions across party lines and whatever, seems to have been completely discredited. What is happening there? Now, do we say America's going to hell in a handbasket at the end of the democracy? I don't think so. I think you say America's going through a really bad time, and there are a whole variety of factors. The role of money in elections, the role of a very polarized media. I think even the change of the FCC regulations requiring balance has created a polarized media where people watch the stations that confirm their prejudices. Excuse me. And you think, what's going to happen there? But I'm convinced that it will be right. Excuse me. Not that it will right itself, but that people will write it. That you'll get to a point where people will say enough is enough. and the kind of know-nothingness that you see in a lot of the political discourse, the magical thinking. All of this is stuff that I think will respond to a different way of thinking, but sometimes you have to get into a crisis. Excuse me.
We are going to have time for your
I
questions.
didn't want to blow your head off.
If people are thinking that they would like to ask a question of the Right Honourable Kim Campbell, we are moving in that direction now, so we want to make sure that you have plenty of time. But I would say that we are here to hear Kim Campbell this afternoon, and I would like it if you would ask questions. And if you have some comments that you want to make after, maybe we can take the time to hear those, but if you ask questions, that would be much appreciated. Just very quickly, what's going on with the Tea Party? You mentioned anger in politics early on in your comments this afternoon.
Well, I'm touched that you think I would be, an expert on that, because I'm not. I actually live in Europe most of the time, and most of my work is outside of North America.
But watching from a distance.
But, well, yeah, no, I mean, I certainly pay attention, and I read I get the Herald Tribune, International Herald Tribune, which is the New York Times in Europe, and I read it pretty carefully. But again, it's this, the ironic thing is that the original Boston Tea Party wasn't a protest against taxes as such. It was a protest against taxation without representation. And in the same way that people are forever nattering about the market and let markets rule and good old Adam Smith, and they've never read Adam Smith. For Adam Smith, the notion of an unregulated market would be anathema. He was a moralist. He was a key thinker of the Scottish Enlightenment. And he believed very strongly in fellowship. The thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment kind of had moved away from religion. They saw religion as being very dogmatic and very divisive of people. And they said that the fundamental basis of human morality is fellow feeling, empathy. And you have to feel for your fellow people. And what Adam Smith is talking about in The Wealth of Nations and the other things that he wrote is when he talks about the market, he's talking about it as a device and a mechanism. And it is a phenomenal device and mechanism for aggregating decisions. But he never for a nanosecond believed that it should just be allowed to run wild. He talks about, big, financial interests and business people as being very selfish, as people having to be constrained. And so you get this incredible, these pundits and these people, politicians blathering on about the market and how un-American it is to have any kind of, Obama's a socialist. I mean, you can go to school if you think he's a socialist. Honestly, So, the mind boggles. I mean, talking about people, living the present differently. I mean, some of us are old enough to remember what socialism really is. And this is the guy that just saved capitalism, and all the people on the left are mad at him for saving capitalism. All the people on the right are calling him a socialism. I think you just give up and go home to Chicago.
You don't really.
No, but actually Chicago's a great city. But anyway, but it's this incredible, people that grab the symbolism and they're angry. And incidentally, I see nothing wrong with people being angry, but it seems to me they're angry at the wrong people. And George W. Bush, who also seems to have managed to plagiarize his memoirs. I mean, wouldn't you think in the era of the internet that's kind of risky?
This afternoon's event is being podcast.
Professors can go online now and they can find, through content analysis, if people are handing in papers that have been plagiarized. But, maybe he's not big on the internet, I don't know. But, here was 8 years of kind of disaster, and tax cuts for the rich, which did not trickle down. And all of these things, and we'll give the rich $1 trillion back in their tax, but we'll also have a war which costs another $1 trillion. So the net loss is $2 trillion, of which you poor people are going to pay. Oh, thank you. And now we're going to boot those Democrats because they didn't fix it overnight. I don't know. I just don't understand. But anyway, so the Tea Party, I quite understand when people are angry. But I do think that there ought to be some kind of rational process to figure out whom you ought to be angry at. And that I don't quite understand. But that's one of the joys of democratic politics.
Okay, there's a young man right toward the top. There you are. Could you please stand? And I'm going to have to restate your question so that everyone can hear you.
Just on the topic of politics and anger, I just want to know if you could offer any insight on the election of Rob Ford in Toronto in the recent municipal election. I just want to know if you think such a movement could be possible in BC in our next election or the coming
Okay, so the preamble was to address the question of the politics of anger, and the questioner is asking whether Ms. Campbell has some comments on the election of Rob Ford, the man who swept the election in Toronto just a few weeks ago. On the headline was "Stop the Gravy Train." That was kind of his thing about government should be streamlined, and any comment?
Well, as you will understand, because we're all Vancouverites here, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about Toronto politics. But insofar as one is forced to do so, they get what they deserve there, the old people. Anyway, Hogtown. But, you know, these are phenomena that come up regularly in politics, and I understand that was an election where there was a lot of twittering and whatever. Well, good for them. But you know, I have the same feeling about that I have about Preston Manning, who I think has a lot to answer for, because Preston Manning created a political movement that was based on the notion that politicians were a bunch of crooks and they were all at the trough. And of course, finally he gets enough people elected to go off to Ottawa, and they discover that that isn't really true, and that it's really expensive to be a member of parliament, and that thanks to the kind of things that they say about politicians, nobody wants to hire you if you're out of office. I mean, unless you happen to have been prime minister, which is a little bit more helpful, but that's a small pool. And so the notion of, again, making people angry. I mean, if there are legitimate problems or scandals or misuses of money, and I don't know what the background of this was in Toronto, but for example, in the British House of Commons, they had this expenditure scandal. And you know what it was created by? It was created by the fact that they couldn't simply decide to give a given housing allowance to members of parliament to come and live in London. If they'd said, as we have here, you know, a housing allowance that you can spend, and except if you actually already live in the capital, you don't get it. But if you have to live, here's what your housing allowance, and you do with it what you want. But because they thought, ooh, that would, you know, people might not like that. So instead, we'll let you claim expenses. Well, you know, so people are claiming the cleaning of his moat. I mean, well, you wonder what they're thinking. But then, of course, they assume it's all going to be kept secret. And, of course, nothing is secret in this day. So you need to have sensible rules about what you can and cannot do with public funds, what you can and cannot do with your expenses. And those rules need to be enforced, and people who breach them need to be embarrassed and turfed, or, you know, maybe lose the election if they're allowed to run again, whatever. But the notion just in general that it's all a kind of a gravy train, unless you are prepared to demonstrate that, what you do is you just create, it's the politics of envy, it's the politics of anger. And to me, that's just a bad place from which to figure out how to live together in a society and how to make public policy. So, you know, there are lots of examples in this country of people winning elections based on those kinds of appeals. But at the end of the day, I don't think they wind up serving the voters very well. And I feel that way about the Reform Party, that I feel that, you know, and all the permutations and combinations and gymnastics and contortions that have gone through it for the Reform Party. You know, and I would say, people would interview me. I remember I was in London and somebody interviewed me. What do you think? I said, well, you know, I know my country. Canada is really quite a centrist country socially. And I don't believe that a party that's socially conservative will ever form a majority government. I mean, they will have supports, and God bless, you know, people are entitled to have their views, and we have a lot of mixed. The nice thing about a big party is that people have to come together, and they have to kind of sand off the extreme corners to begin to find a vision that they can support and move ahead on. And then I would get emails from people, you stupid, you lost, you terrible person, who do you think you are, you know, oh, it's really funny. I think, like, don't shoot the messenger, honey. You know, I'm sorry, a party that's that socially conservative is not going to form a majority. Well, that became very clear. So then they contorted themselves, you know, we're not the Reform Party anymore, we're the Canadian Alliance. I don't know who we're allied with exactly, but we have hopes, you know, we have hopes. We have invitations out there, come and ally with us, even though we're really the Reform Party, but we're calling ourselves the Canadian Alliance. So then, you know, people are moving behind the scenes. They have to have an alternative to the Liberals, so, you know, the Tories are brought in, and some of the Tories are like, no. And quite rightly so, saying, you know, these people are, you know, intolerant, bunch of right-wing loonies. Now they're saying, oh, look, you know, we've got to, you know, trying to provide an alternative party. So some of them, you know, let their pragmatism bring them into the party, and others like Lowell Murray in the Senate State. And so now you have the Conservative Party, which isn't my old Progressive Conservative Party. But again, it's very interesting. No majority. Why? Because people are a little bit worried. If they get a majority, might the wingnuts come out of the woodwork? I don't know. Has he got them under control? Is this what they really are? Yeah. So the fact of the matter is, what Preston Manning started kind of disturbed a whole lot of things, and the old Progressive Conservative Party, and I don't say it because that was my party, and people were entitled to defeat us, but it was a kind of a big tent party that had a lot of really interesting people from different walks of life. And we had some people who were very socially conservative. We had our red Tories. We had people from all across the country. And when you got together, we had to listen to one another. But we came together with a desire for public service, and we kind of grew and learned. And of course, your constituents always blame you if you go Ottawa. But the fact of the matter is you get a sense of the country and you can begin to move ahead and provide an alternative to another party, which is also a big inclusive party, but has a slightly different political center of gravity. And that's, I think, what makes things work. And I think that, so your very long answer to your short question is, I distrust politics of anger and politics of, oh, they're all a bunch of crooks. Because my experience is that they're not, that they're mostly nice people whose communities say, why don't you run? And they do it.
Okay. Next question on the stairs.
Thank you. So, Ms. Campbell, for those of us who are moderate conservatives who are not happy with the new Conservative Party, what should we do?
Well, I don't know. I left the country. I don't know what. The answer is you have to decide, you want to create a new vehicle, you want to work in an existing vehicle and try to change it. It is very hard. And it's sad when you feel that you'd like to be politically involved and you can't find a home. And it doesn't mean that you have to find your ideological soulmates. You have to find people who are prepared to make you part of the conversation and where you feel that you can make a contribution and help create a sense of direction. And I feel bad for people who feel that they can't find that. And whether the current Conservative Party will ever move in that direction, I don't know. I think there are lots of former Progressive Conservatives in it. My old Parliamentary Secretary, Rob Nicholson, who's Minister of Justice, is a very nice guy. He's more conservative than I am, but a very lovely guy. I mean, I think there's some good people there. But, politics really isn't, it's not a precision tool. You really have to kind of find the people where you can kind of hang out and maybe make a difference, recognize that you're not going to agree with everybody, even in your own party. In fact, many of the most vicious political battles are fought within party caucuses. So it's, as Harry Truman said, if you want a friend in Washington, buy a dog.
Gentleman in the fourth row, sir.
A constitutionally limited government, how does it tie in with your notion of democracy, of working democracy?
Well, the question was how does constitutionally limited government tie in with my notion of democracy? Well, constitutionally limited government is really the bedrock, because to me the most important thing about democracy is not elections. Elections are important. Elections are what give legitimacy to certain people to try and make policy within the democratic framework. But the more fundamental notion of democracy, I think, is rule of law. And the thing about rule of law is not that we have laws that we all have to obey, but we have laws that constrain the government. And that's the most fundamental of those laws are the Constitution, where we say that parliaments can't just adjust them by statute. So there are fundamental provisions in a constitution. Now, different countries have different views of what those constitutional limits should be. The Americans have separation of powers. We have parliamentary supremacy, but we still have, and particularly even more so with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which enhance the right of the courts to find our laws consistent or not with provisions of our Constitution. We've always had the constitutional limits of our federal provincial jurisdictions, for example. But I think those are really important. And they're not just important for making sure that we can constrain government. They're important because they communicate the ethos that government has to obey the law, that nothing puts you above the law, whether you're a prime minister, whether you're a member of parliament, whether you're a mayor of a city. There is an underlying law. And now, in societies, you have to struggle sometimes to have those limits respected, and there are many countries that are not democratic who have, quote, these wonderful constitutions, like the Soviet Constitution. Although the Soviet Constitution had a great catch-22. because it had this wonderful provision, two provisions. One that said that the Communist Party was the leading organ of all society. So everything had to be read in light of the fact that the party could overrule it at any time. And they had this wonderful little provision that citizens shall enjoy their rights in exchange for performing their responsibilities. Ooh, now is there a catch-22 or not for you? In other words, you know, rights are not absolute. Rights are, you know, you're a good person, you'll get to have your rights.
Next question.
Obviously, Wikileaks have been a big issue in the news lately. Do you think that's a legitimate way to increase government transparency, or is it irresponsible journalism?
Excellent question.
Well, you know, I think, you know, you give me a plate of cookies, I'm going to eat one, you know. If you put this in front of journalists, they're very likely to print it. And the New York Times went through a long explanation of how they, in fact, redacted a lot of stuff out of the Wikileaks thing and were more you know, responsible in the government. Two things about this. I'm very concerned that someone could hack into this diplomatic correspondence. I think the government needs to, you know, look at that. Because I do think that there is a legitimate expectation of privacy in certain kinds of communications. And, you know, if you send a diplomat out to a country and the diplomat wants to send back a candid assessment of somebody, that doesn't mean that this is your foreign policy. It means that this is a reading of what's there. So you could try to understand, you know, Muammar Gaddafi has a Ukrainian nurse who's always with him now. What's all that about? Is this just hanky-panky, you know, or is she some kind of Rasputnica or something? I don't know. The point is that you need to have this anticipation of privacy in the same way that our private phone conversations have been protected, so that people can be candid. And so that you can actually have an exchange of views. Because somebody might say something, and somebody might say, well, that's actually wrong because I know such, and, you know, I think your judgment's wrong, and you get a big debate, and people decide, you know, is Kim Jong-il crazy? Is Kim Jong-il just, you know, have a short man complex? Is Kim Jong-il? I love Madeleine Albright's discussion in a memoir when she was with Kim Jong-il, and she's standing next to him, and she looked down, and she realized they were both wearing high heels.
And on that note, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Keep well and healthy, and thank you for being my hometown. I love being here. Sit, Kim. Oh, sorry,
I would now like to invite Mark Mahwini to the stage. He is with the UBC Alumni Association for closing comments.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today, not only as a volunteer board member of the Alumni Association, but as a former staffer of Prime Minister Kim, as we used to call you, in the Minister's Regional Office here in Vancouver. You don't contradict a Prime Minister when you work for them, but you did miss one detail today, and that was in reference to the iterations of the Conservative Party. You forgot the Canadian Reform Alliance Party. Affectionately known as CRAP. I think that for the Prime Minister's messages around democracy were particularly salient, given the audacity of hope in the United States, a groundbreaking election, successive minority governments in Canada, and the anti-HST and recall campaigns here in British Columbia. It's a very interesting time in politics and in democracy, and I think that we're very fortunate in Canada to live in a secure democracy, and even in an environment of minority governments, the government still does work and it operates, and I think we're very fortunate to live in a country like ours. So, one last thing, Kim, there's a job opening that might be coming in the federal scene. You've been the first female Prime Minister of Canada for the Progressive Conservatives. I think you should run for the Liberal leadership. First female Prime Minister to be the Prime Minister in both parties.
I'm not that big on firsts.
today. It's great to have an alum here with us, and I thought the message was great, and it's always fun to listen to you speak, so thank you very much. And often when I watch moderators, I judge how good they are with respect to how comfortable I feel. And I think Catherine did a great job. I felt like I was sitting in my own living room having a private conversation with Kim, so thank you very much for that. We have a small token of our appreciation here. I chose them.
Beautiful. That was lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.